Good evening and welcome to Conversations Live Forgiveness. I'm Patty Satalia. However you define forgiveness, its power is real and never more than when we struggle with the unforgivable. Forgiveness can't change the past, but can it change the future? Our experts will discuss that and take your questions. Our toll-free number is 1-800-543-8242, and our email address is connect@wpsu.org. You can also join us on Twitter. Find us under the address @WPSU and use the hashtag WPSU Conversations. Now let's meet our guests. Kenneth Briggs has written about religion and culture for nearly 40 years. His book, The Power of Forgiveness, is a companion to the PBS documentary from Journey Films. It examines the force of forgiveness at work in the world. Terry Roberts is a mother, wife, and grandmother who was propelled into the public eye 7 years ago when her son shot and killed 5 girls in a nickel mines Amish schoolhouse in Lancaster County and seriously injured 5 others. That same day, the Amish community forgave her son. Today, Roberts shares her experiences and her journey with others. And joining us by Skype is Donald Craybill, professor and senior fellow at the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies at Elizabethtown College. Internationally recognized for his scholarship on the Amish and other Anabaptist groups, he is the author of 16 books, including Amish Grace: How Forgiveness Transcended Tragedy. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I think depending upon what dictionary you pick up, you will find various definitions for forgiveness, but I'll read one. The dictionary defines forgiveness as giving up any thought of revenge or harm, even when it might be justified. I'll begin with you, Kenneth Briggs. Explain what forgiveness is and isn't.
Well, first of all, I think we all are in situations all the time where one of the responses we can make to slights against us, wrongs against us, injustices, pain and suffering that we've felt from others. Forgiveness is one of the possible responses we can make. It is the one, so far as I believe, that takes us farthest away from the destructiveness of reacting in a vengeful or harmful manner in return for the harm that's done for us. It's not easy. I think it requires something that's counterintuitive, goes against a lot of our natural instincts, but it's something that has healing power when it's possible and when it's done.
So you're saying it's an option, but it's an option that we too seldom take.
Right.
Right. It's often said, forgiveness is often described as the greatest gift imaginable, and Terry Roberts, you know that firsthand. Tell us a little bit about your story.
Okay. Well, for us, the story of forgiveness and the way this came about, it became a bigger story than the event itself. So that's how it affected our lives, in that it took the spotlight on what was the most horrendous thing that I could ever imagine and put it on a power that God gave for us to forgive. So, and the response of the Amish community just was such a blessing to us in the midst of that deep, grating sorrow inside that you just didn't know how you were going to face.
When you say the blessing, I think you're referring to the fact that the Amish forgave you and your family and forgave your son for what he did was suddenly national news because we were so astonished, so stunned that someone who suffered that loss could forgive and forgive that quickly.
That was so amazing. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised because that is our Amish community. That is the way they respond. But I know, like for my husband, he was a retired police officer. And for him, all day, on day one, he kept wiping the tears away from his face and had his head hung low. And he wiped so many tears away that he used a dish towel and did that so often that it actually wore the skin off of his forehead. And I didn't see him raise his eyes at all that day. And then when Henry came to visit us that afternoon.
Henry is
Our Amish neighbor. So he's not a father of one of the children, but he is our neighbor. So when he came in and my husband sat at the breakfast bar with his head hung down, Henry just kept comforting and consoling him and saying, Roberts, we love you. We forgive. We don't hold anything against you or your son. And just seeing that happen from across the room as I watched this transpire, and then seeing my husband lift his head and look into Henry's eyes and say, thank you, Henry. That was the first time he lifted his head that day. To me, that was such a gift because from that, I just felt in my spirit, it's going to take an awfully long time, but someday we will heal from this. So that was my first spark of hope in that first day.
Donald Craybill, help us understand how the Amish so quickly came to forgive what for many would be considered unforgivable.
Well, in the Amish community, forgiveness is a very high virtue. I interviewed several dozen of them in the preparation to write the book, and all of them went to the Bible and Jesus' model prayer, Our Father, and said that's why they did it, that that's what Jesus taught them, and they believe that if they forgive, then they will be forgiven by God. If they don't forgive, they won't be forgiven. It's a virtue that is ritualized twice a year in their communion services. Before they take communion, 2 weeks in advance, there's a service, a special 2 to 3 hour service that focuses on forgiveness. Children are taught it at a young age. So I asked one bishop about the speed of it, and he said, well, it was a decided issue. I said, what do you mean by decided? He said, well, we didn't have to talk about it. We just knew it was the right thing to do. And I would propose we wouldn't be here tonight talking about this story if it had not happened so quickly, within 6 or 7 hours of this horrific event. That's what shocked the world. Typically in American society, if we have the courage to embark on the journey of forgiveness, it may take us several weeks, several months, or several years. And to have this happen so quickly was just absolutely astonishing.
The interesting thing about what you just said, the courage to forgive, and yet we tend to look at forgiveness as a sign of weakness. Kenneth Briggs.
It takes a lot of courage. You asked earlier about what is forgiveness. For me, there are two dimensions to it. One has to do with our feelings and our thoughts. It means letting go of bitterness and letting go of resentment, letting go of hostility. And the second dimension, which in this definition was given by one of the Amish fathers who lost a daughter, he said, for me, forgiveness is giving up my right to retaliate, giving up my right to revenge. That's the behavioral dimension. So it has a subjective feeling, emotional dimension, as well as a behavioral dimension as well. And it's hard to let go of things, let go of the bitterness.
And yet, forgiveness, Kenneth Briggs, doesn't mean giving up the right to hold somebody accountable.
Right. We sometimes use forgiveness as a sign of weakness when we mean that in the American competitive spirit, it's a zero-sum game. If you forgive me, then I've gained some power over you. And it's not as if we both benefit. That's the common, ordinary thinking. It's hard to tell sometimes from an external point of view when forgiveness has been genuine and when it hasn't been. When it may be manipulative rather than, for example, husbands, wives, one might apologize to the other as a way of getting a little more of a hold on that other person's will. Say, I've been the virtuous one now. And it works the other way, too. People see it as a way of gaining power over the person who's forgiven. We think of those in the common, ordinary terms, And it doesn't make much sense. Like, I'm not going to give anything unless I'm going to get something equal in return. And that's where it falters for a lot of people.
Well, that brings me back to Donald Craybill, because there has been some quiet criticism that perhaps the Amish were so quick that perhaps it wasn't sincere. And, you know, all religions teach forgiveness, but many would say that no one does it like the Amish. Can you respond to the criticism that perhaps it came too soon before they could have worked out their anger and their anguish?
Well, the nickel mine situation is very interesting because in this case, well, let me preface this by saying psychologists sometimes say forgiveness can only be transacted between the offender and the victim. Well, in this case, the offender had taken his own life, and he was gone. And 10 of the 5 of the children were dead. The other 5 were struggling for their lives. The parents weren't at that stage engaged in forgiveness. They were worried about funerals. So what you have in nickel mines is representatives of the Amish community, self-appointed, spontaneously going to Terry and her husband and 3 other men, unknown that Henry had gone to Terry's house. 3 other men went to Marie's home, Charlie's wife, and her parents, and basically expressed, again, ideas of grace, forgiveness, and empathy for this terrible thing that somebody from their tribe had done to the Amish tribe. So it was sincere, but it was habitual. It's a habit that the Amish cultivate.
And it's because they practice forgiveness.
Right, and I brush my teeth every day. Well, am I sincere about that? I don't know. I don't think about it, you know, every time, but I do it. It's a good habit. It's a habit that I learned in childhood. There are many virtuous habits that we have. Does it mean it's easy? No. There were many, many tears for the Amish. It was extremely painful. It wasn't as though it was some mechanistic or robotic sort of thing. It was deeply painful for them. And I talked to an Amish father who lived some miles away about 8 weeks later, and he said, Don, every morning I get up and I think about nickel mines, I have to start in forgiveness all over again. It's not like it's a once and done thing. It's a journey. But what's different about Amish forgiveness is they make a commitment to do the forgiveness, and then they go on the journey. Many times in American society, if we decide to take that journey, we work at it, and maybe over 6 or 7 years, eventually get to the place where we can say, I'm going to forgive. But in either case, it's a process, and it's different for every person. There's no recipe. There's no template for it. There's no right way to do it. It's very situational and contextual. But the important thing is to at least walk toward the journey and start the journey, even though it may take a long time.
You wanted to add something, Kenneth
Yeah,
Briggs.
I wanted to underscore that. I agree very much with that. And I think forgiveness is a practice that we can choose to adopt. How authentic any one instance of that practice is, we'll never know. We don't know that. But we do know that there's a sincere willingness to engage in the practice. And sometimes, particularly in hard cases, that is the breakthrough itself.
We're going to take a phone call in a moment, but I first want to say to Terry Roberts, just hours after you learned the horrific news that your son was responsible for the killing at nickel mines, the Amish were at your door. Mm-hmm. And before that, you thought, we will be the pariahs of the community. We're going to have to leave our community. This is just so horrific.
That was the gift. I mean, it was just amazing to see that acceptance, and then to see my husband receive it, and to receive that in myself. It was like, wow, we will not be shunned from our community. That was the immediate feeling. So to have that on day one was quite incredible, to have the kind of support that we had, and then to see what kind of effect that had on us, and that continued through the whole process.
And to what extent did that have an impact on how you were able to forgive your own family, your son, for this
Well, you know, I didn't even think about the idea of forgiving my son until we had already, it was in the news, you know, and I thought, wow, am I forgiving our son? And as I thought about that, I was like the second or third night into this, and I thought, wow, am I forgiving? If I wouldn't forgive him, I would have the same hole in my heart that he had of bitterness. And no, I could not do that. Yeah, so I did forgive my son. And for me, it was different. I know, like for the Amish, they say they're forgiving every day they meet that. For me, it was like I forgave him, and it was a one-time act. And it's not that the horror of what he caused doesn't come back and sadden me at many times, but the forgiveness is there. It was a choice to forgive him, and yeah. So the Amish, and their response was just. Yeah.
Okay, we'll go now to our first phone call. This is Robert from Hollidaysburg. Robert, what's your question or comment, please?
Well, my question is that, my comment is that I think that we have to go back to the biblical premise where the person who commits the crime has to ask for forgiveness in the first place, because for us to be forgiven by God, Christ said in John, we have to ask Him to ask for our forgiveness. And I think Dr. Graybill from Elizabethtown College, I'm brethren, and so is he, and it's a brethren college. I think that we brethren have the concept that it has to be based on a biblical factor before it can be really effective.
Can you respond to that, Donald Graybill?
Yeah, let me respond this way. One thing I didn't say when you ask about the definition of forgiveness, there are really two types of forgiveness. The one type is where the victim responds with forgiveness regardless of how the offender, regardless of what the offender does. The offender may not be contrite, may not be remorseful, may not say, I'm sorry. But that's one type of forgiveness where it's only the hard emotional and spiritual work of the victim. And that is a more recent psychological development, I would say, in the last 50 years, where forgiveness is in your own best interest as a victim to let go of the bitterness and move on with your life, even if the offender doesn't apologize. The biblical notion, the older classical notion, is that forgiveness depends on apology. For example, as the caller said, the offender needs to take the first step and say, I'm sorry, I apologize, I don't know why I did that, I'm so remorseful. And then the victim can respond with forgiveness. Now, the problem is, what if the offender never apologizes? Well, then the victim is stuck with remorse and anger, and bitterness could be all their life. And so psychologists would say it's important that we just let go of those things and move forward.
And the forgiveness is for ourselves. Precisely.
It's cheaper than prescription drugs. Our heart rate goes down, the psychologists tell us. Our blood pressure goes down, and so on. So it's one way of moving forward. Otherwise, we are hostages to hostility, and the offender is still controlling our minds from the past, and we can obsess with that, and we don't have a healthy or wholesome way of life and quality of life.
If you're just joining us, I'm Patty Satalia, and this is Conversations Live Forgiveness on WPSU TV, WPSU FM in Central Pennsylvania, and on WQLN TV in Erie. Our guests tonight are Kenneth Briggs, author of The Power of Forgiveness, Terry Roberts, who shares her very personal experiences on the power of forgiveness, and joining us on Skype is Donald Graybill, professor and senior fellow at the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies at Elizabethtown College. Our telephone number is 1-800 1-800-543-8242, and our panelists are ready to take your phone calls. If you'd prefer to email us, our email address is connect@wpsu.org. You can also join us on Twitter. Find us under the address @WPSU and use the hashtag WPSU Conversations. And now we go to Marilyn, who has been patiently hanging on from Bedford, Pennsylvania. What's your comment or question, please, Marilyn?
Well, it seems to me that forgiveness requires a generosity of spirit. I was a pastor in Blacksburg, Virginia, when the shootings happened at Virginia Tech. And a carload of Amish came to our chapel to have prayer with us, which was extremely touching. And we used the Power of Forgiveness video for healing in that community. Then as I was watching a couple weeks ago, I think this is the second time I've seen several shows on PBS about the Amish, I thought about the forgiveness and how powerful that is and how we all work on that. None of us are perfect, but we work on that. But I wondered about the connection, since the conversation is focusing on the Amish, between that generosity of spirit that works to help with forgiveness, but where is that in terms of shunning with the Amish community? And I thought maybe those there might have some insight on that.
Donald Craybill?
Yes, I can address that. After the nickel mines event, some people ask us as we were writing the book, well, why could the Amish forgive an outside person who came in and shot 10 of their girls and 5 of them died? And yet if an adult member of the church who was unmarried fell in love with an outsider, that person would be excommunicated and shunned. Where's the forgiving spirit there? In fact, in our book, Amish Grace, we devote an entire chapter to exploring that question. The answer quickly is this. Charles Roberts had never joined the Amish church, had never taken a baptismal vow. And so in his case, the Amish extended forgiveness, but they also said that if he were still living, they would expect that the state would be responsible for justice and that probably he would go to prison, and they would support that. And so in that case, they weren't responsible for justice because he wasn't part of the church. The Amish join the church as young adults from 18 to 24 typically. They take a baptismal vow to not only be commitment, make a lifelong commitment to the Christian church, to confess their faith in Jesus Christ, but also to uphold the teachings of the church for the rest of their life. They make that vow on their knees in front of, to God, in front of the witnesses in their congregation. So from the Amish perspective, if someone as an adult member of the church breaks that vow and digresses from the church, they typically work hard to bring them back. But if the person insists and is not willing to confess that they bought a car, let's say, for example, or did something else, then that would lead to excommunication and shunning. And it's a kind of parental discipline exercised by the church to remind the person that they broke this vow and that this is a serious matter. They can't just hop around from church to church. For the Amish, they expect enduring commitments, whether it's a commitment to the church or marriage for the rest of their life. And so they see their role as exercising justice and also forgiveness. They would say, we forgive the person, but we also expect that there's some discipline. And if the person ever wants to come back, they are welcome to come back if they're willing to apologize for what they did.
Well, let's talk a little bit about apologies. Is apologizing as difficult for most of us as forgiving is?
Yes.
Kenneth Briggs.
I think it is. I think it is. Apology requires one trait that forgiveness shares, and that is to be honest about what you've done. That's a very hard thing for most of us to do, to look at what our part in the deal has been. And I think in everyday apologizing is, we know from every single one of us knows how those words stick in the throat when it comes right down to it, because again, we think we're going to lose something by giving this up to somebody else, that somebody's going to be better than us, we're going to be judged, or something's going to happen.
We know what forgiving did for the Roberts family. What did forgiving do for the forgiver?
Presumably, and I think the Bible shows that forgiveness, particularly in the New Testament, arises out of the forgiver. Jesus approaches the paralytic, and the paralytic is hurt and disabled. And what does Jesus say? Your sins are forgiven. I think sometimes the forgiver has the insight, the spiritual insight, and inspiration to make that, to take that initiative, to start a healing process. So I think there is something at root in the forgiver that is essential.
Although forgiveness is part of the teachings of virtually all religions, Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, is faith a necessary component, Kenneth Briggs, of forgiveness?
I don't think so. I think it takes something beyond our ordinary experience or our cultural training, which puts us in a give and take, win lose kind of position most of the time. But I think it is not specifically religious in all cases.
Terry Roberts, tell us a little bit about what you have done since this tragedy. You have been visiting and being a caregiver to one of the children who was most seriously injured every Thursday, I believe, since this happened. Tell us how that came to be and what it means to you and to the Amish community.
Well, to tell how it came to be would be a little bit of a story. My husband and I started visiting the Amish families in January, February, March, and this happened in October. So at that point, we had started visiting the families, and in doing that, developing relationships. And then in the summertime, we invited the families to come to our home for a picnic. And that was such a precious healing time because the oldest boy in the school, at the end of that picnic, what he said to me was just worth everything, because he came up to me and he shook my hand and he said, Mrs. Roberts, thank you for inviting us to your home. We had so much fun. So, and that just filled my heart, and for him to be able to do that. But at that picnic, I invited the children to bring bathing suits because my sister has an above-ground pool, and just the boys swam, not the girls. So after everybody left, I said to my husband, wow, that's not fair. The little girls didn't get to swim. So as I slept on that night, I thought, I could have the girls over for tea and they could go swimming. So that's how I started having the girls over. And from that, that became a tradition that is just precious to me. And then that year, toward the end of that first year, in October, I thought, well, why not have the mothers to tea? And that is what started just a wonderful time together. But at that tea, after we had our tea and we moved out into the sunroom, we all sat around and I said, how about if we go around the room and we each talk about a highlight and the lowest point of our experience this year? And so that was just a very precious time. But what came from that was something that was already stirring in my heart. I was feeling this need to somehow reach out to Rosanna's family. And
this is the 6-year-old at the time.
Yeah, she was 6. She is now 13. Injured. And her mother's response was, everyone here has a different experience than mine. They've either lost a daughter, or their daughter has healed well, or they just had sons in the school. And I still have my daughter, but she's not fully, where she was. So that was my opportunity then to reach out and to ask if if they would like if I would come and be a part of her life, and what could that look like. And then she said if I wanted to come by one night a week, that would be
So one night
accepted.
a week, and your role is as caregiver.
As caregiver, I just look forward to Thursday nights because I'm there with Rosanna and just seeing responses from her, and yeah, it's been absolutely wonderful. But the gift of them to allow me into their home.
You know, at least we think that only Amish forgive. I'm thinking of this past January, the father of 17-year-old Claire Davis at a public memorial on New Year's. He asked the people in this community in Colorado to honor his daughter by forgiving the gunman. Your reaction to that?
Yeah, in fact, it's a good transition to something I was thinking about. It's useful and beneficial to talk about the Amish and the discussion that they've opened up. That's been great. But to concentrate too narrowly on Amish forgiveness would be to miss the point of what's going on in the ordinary lives of American people. And by that, I mean both the resistance to forgiveness and the accomplishment of resistance in everyday life, in that we wouldn't survive on a domestic basis or a neighborhood basis or a community basis without degrees of forgiveness that in fact are done all the time, not in the big dramatic cases.
You're talking, and you write about this in your book, as the one-way street of forgiveness and the two-way street of forgiveness. And most of what we encounter on a day-to-day basis is this two-way, where there's enough blame to go around. Partners, for example, husbands and wives are maybe equally guilty.
Somebody spreads a rumor about us, and we're very upset about it. But then we forget that we, in a very, what we thought, polite manner, had discredited this person in a public forum, or something of that kind. And not just that those little offenses happen, but that people do overcome them very often. You think of, again, brothers, sisters, husbands, wives, partners of all kinds. There are all sorts of things that annoy the living daylights out of us all the time, and sometimes we regard them as offenses. He always takes the last portion of the roast beef. And on and on and on, and yet we make allowances, and I think some credit needs to go to that. It's not foreign. It's not just communally done, and in some ways it's easier for the Amish to do stuff communally because there is a reinforcement, and that's a good. But most of us are on our own and don't have that, and yet it still happens to some degree on that level.
Fred Luskin, who is with the Stanford Forgiveness Project, says that 70% of what bothers couples and relationships still bothers them years later, and so we have to learn to forgive each other for who we are.
Very much so, very much so.
All right, so let's go to, we have a Twitter question we'd like to go to. A common maxim, this is from Brad, tells us to associate forgiveness and forgetting. Forgive and forget. What might it mean to forgive and remember? And I think that's an excellent point. Kenneth Briggs, can you respond to that?
I think that word game is intriguing. Sometimes we will say, I forgive, but by golly, I'm never going to forget. And sometimes that means I'm never going to forgive, and sometimes it doesn't. So it's a tricky, from a theoretical point of view, it's a valid distinction that I'm going to keep it in mind in case something like that comes up again and so on, in a detached, neutral manner. But sometimes the forgetting is also colored by a lot of lingering resentment, for example, or wariness or distrust or something. Again, things are not black and white.
All right. Anything to add to that, Donald Craybill?
I think forgiveness does not mean forgetting. I don't think it's possible to forget if it's an egregious offense of some kind. I think forgiveness means that we remember it in a different way, and we may understand or have different thoughts about the offender or the offense. But psychologically, I don't think it's possible to forget, and I think it's not helpful to equate the two together. This relates to a question you asked early on: what is forgiveness not? I would say, number one, it's not about forgetting. It's not about pardon. It doesn't mean that persons are not held accountable for what they've done. It's not about justice, and it doesn't mean the same as reconciliation. Many times, reconciliation never happens if someone forgives. The offender may not be interested. In Terry's case, we have a wonderful story of reconciliation where she was reconciled with the Amish families and has a very strong, positive, ongoing relationship. But in many cases, forgiveness may open the door to possible reconciliation, but reconciliation, by its very definition, requires both people to be engaged.
Okay. Doug from Grampian, you're on the air. What's your question or comments?
Yeah, I just had first my heart goes out to Terry and her husband, and for the loss of their son and stuff. But I don't understand why the Amish would feel that they would have to go and ask or tell them that they forgive them when they wouldn't really. I wouldn't think they couldn't help what their son did. You know, so I'm not clear on why the Amish would feel that they would have to go forgive them.
I think you felt like you needed forgiveness, didn't you?
I know my husband did. Yeah, because, I mean, he definitely felt that he wouldn't face them. So it was the son that we raised, you know. So, no, we did not commit the act. And yet, as I speak to people of other cultures, like I've had the opportunity now numerous times to share with Japanese culture, and had them come up to me afterwards and say, wow, if you lived in our country, your whole family would be ostracized for what your son had done. You would not be able to show your face in your community again. And so that really gives me a heart to reach out to them because of that. But yes, no, did we commit the crime? No, we did not. And yet that forgiveness was very powerful in our lives and really, I would say, helped us to move forward.
Could I add something to that?
Please.
I think in some ways the initial response of the Amish community was in some ways almost more about grace than forgiveness. One Amishman said to me, and I think this is an excellent statement of compassion. He said, Don, he said, the Roberts family had a heavier burden to bear than we did. And what he meant by that is he understood the shame and the stigma and just the terrible feeling that would come to a family with one of their members doing this kind of thing. So in many ways, this is really a story about compassion and grace and reaching out. The word forgiveness was used, but I think the Amish people weren't, in an academic sense, drawing sharp distinctions between these terms, which we do sometimes. So it's really a story about grace, and part of grace is forgiveness.
Well, this is interesting because, and this I think is in your book, Kenneth Briggs, when people can't forgive, research shows that they tend to become more hopeless in other ways. So if we can forgive, we can deal with life.
I think it's a healthy thing to do. And now the science has come along and said, not only is it healthy for the spirit, but it'll be healthier for you physically too. Your blood pressure will go down, and some of the other vital signs will be improved, so that there may be a benefit. That raises as many problems as it does answers. But and by the way, I want to give credit to that last caller. I think that's a very good question about whether an issue was raised that didn't exist, and whether a situation of forgiveness was created when none was necessary, but maybe a reaching out to gathering in the parents of this tragic young man, making him part of the community that was mourning? I do. I think that was a very, very good question.
Well, it's interesting because in your book you talk about forgiveness among individuals and communities, but in Chapter 8 you explore this idea of forgiveness as indispensable to the survival of a nation. And that made me think about the Holocaust. It made me think about Clinton, for example, apologizing for slavery. In 1988, President Reagan apologized for the Japanese internment during World War II. And I'm wondering how important those statements were to those who suffered at the hands, of those who were in internment camps in World War II, for example, for a nation to apologize for mistakes they've made.
Undoubtedly, it matters some. How much is hard to determine. We have been a country that would have been fractured irreparably were it not for some degree of forgiveness. I don't know how African Americans have come to terms with this. I don't know how Native Americans have come to terms with this. But these were, to all intents and purposes, crimes against humanity that somehow they have responded to with more than resentment and with something like a response that has allowed us to remain, again, maybe it's a partial response, maybe all responses are partial to some degree. But you're quite right. I mean, without forgiveness, we wouldn't exist. We wouldn't have existed even as a United States of America once the Articles of Confederation had us at each other's throats and almost destroyed whatever possibility there was of even having a nation. So that became something too. So it's vital.
You quote a Lebanese psychotherapist who is talking about, peace. She's lived through civil war in Lebanon, and she says, you can't get peace without going through the barbed wire fence of forgiveness. I mean, forgiveness isn't easy. Why is it so difficult for so many of us? It wasn't difficult for the Amish, but for average Americans, it seems to be rather difficult.
I think it's difficult for everybody. I don't know how the Amish live day to day and what gets forgiven and what doesn't. I assume they do practice forgiveness, but I don't know what the measured pain and suffering is there any more than anywhere else. But the root of it, according to at least in Christian history, would be the number one sin, which is pride. We are very prideful and do not like to admit mistakes. And again, when we're in a competitive society that values clean resumes and an upward and onward march in our careers, our lives, without flaws, discovering flaws is very costly, as we know politically. So it becomes incumbent then to be honest with ourselves in order to do that, and it's very difficult to gain that measure of honesty. And I sympathize. I mean, I'm caught in it just as much as anybody else.
Your daughter-in-law, Terry Roberts, she wrote an open letter to the Amish community, and she said, "Your compassion has reached beyond our family, beyond our community, and is changing our world. And for this, we sincerely thank you." Have there been ripple effects in your community, do you think, as a result of that?
Absolutely. I mean, I know personally of situations where forgiveness happened because of the impact of this in our community. I mean, I have a personal friend that actually forgave a very old-time offense that was extremely serious. And even though there wasn't reconciliation, it was lifted from her. And yes, so there were numerous situations right in the community that I knew of that it affected dramatically.
Donald Craybill, is there evidence that there really was a ripple effect from that gracious forgiveness of the Roberts family?
Well, I think one example is that Amish people, parents and others from the community, have been invited to a number of situations, such as the Virginia Tech one, which was mentioned by one of our callers. But just a few weeks ago, a busload of some 45 or 50 Amish people went up to Sandy Hook Elementary School and spent time with the parents there at the invitation of those parents. So to receive invitations like that, and there have been a number of them, I think indicates that the witness and the virtue of forgiveness articulated by the Amish community has been heard not only in the United States but around the world. I mean, I've given a number of lectures about it internationally because people are interested in how was this possible in terms of the Amish context.
Can you talk, Kenneth Briggs, a little bit about the science of forgiveness? Because there are now universities who are, they offer forgiveness programs. The United Nations has forgiveness programs, and this does seem to be something that's catching on nationwide, actually worldwide.
Yeah, part of it is a very, I think, useful behavioral program that says, if you want to change the way you feel, change the way you think. And there are ways of opening up minds in the right atmosphere where people will consider another way of going about something. And I think the experimentation that's going on is very helpful, and it awakens a lot of people to the very subject. I wouldn't be surprised, and I can't prove it, that the rising opposition to capital punishment in this country has something to do with the discussion that's going on, even in its uneven fashion and its scattered fashion. That something is going on there that says, before we jump to revenge conclusion, let us consider all the factors, including the DNA and all the rest of it, that at one time would not have been paid as much attention to. And I think there's now more willingness on people to say, well, maybe that's a reason to rethink this whole thing. So there may be something good going on here.
I want to get back to something that was said a little bit earlier, and that was that the Amish practice forgiveness. You know, if we practice hatred, we're going to get very good at it. So I'm curious to know, how does one begin practicing forgiveness?
Well, I think the first requirement for anybody is to think the situation through as best you can. What happened? What exactly happened? And what's happened to me because of it? And what do I want to live with here? And I think that begins at least a thought process or an emotional yearning for something better than misery. And I think it has an effect. And I think also for Christians anyway, if Christians take the time to say the Lord's Prayer every day and do say, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those, like, you're not getting nothing unless you give something. I think it sort of implants a view there that even though we don't like it, Jesus makes that kind of a principle that we can't avoid. I mean, Jesus doesn't say, and I'm not just trying to speak just from a Christian point, he doesn't say, well, if you feel like it, or if it happens, the circumstances happen to be right, go ahead and forgive. He says, no, 70 times 7, which was the symbol for an eternal number of forgiveness, you got to keep doing this. And there's not choice B in the process.
Although in your book you talk about Judaism as having the most historic and rich teachings of forgiveness.
Yes, and that refers to an item I mentioned earlier. In Judaism, the common tradition is that the offender must ask for it, and the process begin that way. I'm not sure it happens all that way all the time in Jewish life, but that is a rather set series of stages that, and I think very helpful to Shua.
I want to go to an email comment or question that we have. This one comes from David. He says, is part of the thought process in the Anabaptist approach to forgiveness that the world is a preparation place for a more blissful world to come? In other words, the normal feelings of revenge and hate should be given up because they are ultimately much less important than the reward of heaven. And if we could get you, Donald Craybill, to respond to that.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's thought of in connection to eternal life, but I would say in the Anabaptist tradition, two things. One is that it's all about following Jesus. And the central theological question is, what does it mean to follow Jesus daily in life? And as we've just said, forgiveness is a central virtue in Jesus' teachings. There's numerous cases where it's very clear that there's an expectation that his followers forgive. But the second piece that relates clearly to the nickel mines is that the understanding is that we don't need to take justice into our own individual hands, but vengeance and justice is God's business. And so we, in a sense, kick the justice can upstairs. And I think that makes it easier for Amish people and some other Anabaptists to forgive, because it's not my business to retaliate. That's God's responsibility to take care of the justice question.
And in fact, someone in Charles Roberts' case said that he will be facing a just God. And that's why this particular Amish family was saying to the members of their family, don't seek revenge.
Yes.
I'm sorry, were you finished, Dr. Craybill?
Well, I was going to add another comment. One, I asked an Amish person, well, what about Robert's destiny? What about eternity? And this Amish man responded with what I thought was an extremely empathetic response. He said, I can only wish for him what I wish for myself, that God would be a merciful and just God.
Interesting. We go to Rhonda, who's calling us from State College. Rhonda, are you there? We lost the call. You know, we said earlier that forgiveness is rarely discussed in this country, and I wonder, though, if sometimes we actually unwittingly perpetuate this cycle of hate and anger that people who can't forgive are in. And I ask that because, you know, if a friend tells us that their husband has done something horrible, our instinct is to say, oh, I hope you tell the jerk off or something like that. It's not to, our first reaction isn't to say, well, can you forgive him? Can you talk a little bit about that, Kenneth Briggs?
Well, again, I think from a societal point of view, it's revenge, or it's getting even, or it's making sure that nobody makes a fool of you, and all that kind of stuff. But I think there are still currents underneath in either the subconscious or other aspects of our lives that call us to a different, set up some tension with that. So even though we're doing it and mowing down our opponents or those who accuse us, we're still we haven't kind of lost yet that consciousness that something else is possible here, and maybe we ought to be doing something else. It's not an even playing field, but it makes it both harder to do it because the idea of forgiveness is celebrated. Everyone loves the idea of forgiveness. It's the practice of it that gets into that. And I think that even the response to the idea itself is an indication that something is going on in us still that kind of wants us to step in that direction.
Terry Roberts, your son Zachary is actually making a film about this experience. It's called Hope. And I think this story has given lots of people hope that if this can be forgiven and your family embraced and you embrace the Amish family, that anyone can forgive. Tell us about the film and what it means to you.
Okay. Well, the film is about, it's the story of my life, basically, because I've been through a lot before the tragedy with cancer. And so it will kind of tell the whole life story. But the idea of it is to be able to share with the world how we can walk through the darkest hour of our lives and still have hope and a future. And that whatever has happened in our lives isn't the end all. And if we're going to focus on that 24/7, it's going to take us to a dark place. But if we take whatever is in our lives and we can find forgiveness and we can move forward, then it's part of the character of who we are. And you know, for me, it's serving my God in the way He calls us to live. So the documentary will just, and we'll share hope for a future.
We have just a couple of minutes remaining, but Kenneth Briggs, forgiveness is much more the exception than the rule. And I'm wondering, from your perspective and your study of forgiveness, what can change that?
I don't know. I think I believe witnesses like Terry and the Amish and the explanations that Donald Craybill can give to it and the emphasis, I think that helps. But as every sacred book in the world will say, the struggle's been there forever between the destructive and the salvific. So we shouldn't expect it to go away soon.
Donald Craybill, with literally just 30 seconds, what can you add to this, spreading the word for forgiveness?
Well, I think we need examples, because everything in our culture, in modern culture, tends to focus on violence, revenge, retaliation, whether it's films, video games, our support of military service. All of these things really emphasize the use of force and retaliation. And I think we need to hold high the lights, the voices, the examples that model forgiveness as a better way and a good way and an important way that's very central to not only our personal well-being, but to our existence as a human community.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of our guests. Kenneth Briggs is author of The Power of Forgiveness. Terry Roberts, wife, mother, grandmother, and public speaker. And Donald Craybill, professor and senior fellow at the Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies at Elizabethtown College. For resources on tonight's topic, visit our website, wpsu.org/conversationslive. And we hope you'll join us for our March 20th call-in. Our topic is colon cancer, which kills about 50,000 Americans each year. Thank you all for watching and listening. I'm Patty Satalia. For all of us here at WPSU, have a good night.